Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet visit with the past. In tonight's episode, we'll drift softly into the golden twilight of Byzantium, to the story of a woman who rose from the dust of the stage to the throne of an empire. This is Theodora, the dancer who became Byzantium's most feared empress. Maybe you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or perhaps you're already resting with heavy eyes. However you arrived here, I'm grateful. I love imagining these quiet stories traveling across the world, reaching you wherever you are, whenever you listen. If these calm journeys through history bring you peace, don't forget to subscribe and let the past keep you company on gentle nights ahead. Now settle in. The lamps are low, the city of Constantinople waits, and our story begins. You open your eyes, and it is dawn in Constantinople. The air is soft with the faintest salt from the Bosporus, and a slow mist rolls between the spires, domes, and walls of the city that calls itself eternal. You hear water against stone, a rhythm older than the empire itself, and the sound of sandals scuffing over worn marble pavements. The year is somewhere in the early 500s. The Western Roman Empire has already collapsed. Rome itself is little more than a provincial shadow. But here, in the east, in the city Constantine built upon the ruins of Byzantium, the empire endures, polished, bureaucratic, stubbornly alive. The city wakes not with a roar, but a gradual hum. Bakers light their ovens near the Mace, the great avenue that slices through Constantinople like a spine. The first cries of merchants rise into the cool air. Bread, salted fish, olives, and a few sleepy citizens shuffle past the colonnades, carrying baskets or water jars. Above them, pigeons crowd the eaves of buildings so old that no one remembers who laid their foundations. If you were to look from one of the city's 7 hills, you would see a patchwork of contrasts. The golden dome of a church beside a soot-streaked tavern, the glittering mosaics of a palace a few steps away from crumbling wooden tenements. This is the world into which Theodora would someday be born. But for now, the city itself is the story. Constantinople, at the start of the 6th century, was home to perhaps 500,000 people, one of the largest cities in the known world. It was a place of sharp divisions, of status carved into stone and law. Senators and nobles lived in marble villas close to the palace, while craftsmen and laborers crowded into narrow lanes, their walls sweating in the heat of summer. Between them, a river of commerce and noise flowed endlessly. Slaves carrying amphorae, scribes walking to the imperial chancery, soldiers on patrol, beggars dozing beside the forums. Everything had its order, its rhythm, and its hierarchy. Even boredom was stratified. At the city's heart stood the hippodrome, vast and echoing, its tiers of stone seats waiting for the crowds that would come later in the day. For now, it was quiet. The sand still raked smooth, the air faintly smelling of horses. The statues around its spina, the long central barrier, glittered in the early light. Bronze horses taken from Greece, a serpent column looted from Delphi. Fragments of forgotten empires rearranged to celebrate the living one. The hippodrome was more than entertainment. It was the city's heartbeat. There, the factions, the blues and the greens, cheered, fought, and schemed. They were not merely sporting clubs, but political machines, with loyalties stretching deep into the city's neighborhoods. Later, those same factions would burn the capital to its foundations in one of history's most violent riots. But for now, they slept. If you walked a little further, past the Augustine Square and the palace walls, you'd find the great church, the old Hagia Sophia, before it was destroyed in fire and rebuilt to the form we know. The air around it always smelled faintly of incense. The priests there began their day with whispered liturgy in Greek, their words echoing softly in the half-light. In those hours before the city fully wakes, Constantinople feels less like a place and more like a mechanism. An intricate machine of stone, faith, and trade, each part turning slowly against the next. Its people moved according to habit and habit was its true ruler. Even the emperor, at this moment, the aged Anastasius III, ruled by routine. He inspected petitions, signed decrees, oversaw the minting of coins. His face, stamped in gold, travelled further than his name ever would. Coins bearing his image passed through the hands of sailors in Alexandria, merchants in Antioch, and shepherds in Armenia. For many, that was the empire, a thin circle of metal gleaming in the sun. Beneath all that gold, though, was dust. The city's poorer quarters, like those near the old harbour or behind the circus, smelled of fish oil, sweat, and smoke. Here lived the craftsmen who made the pottery, the women who spun wool, the handlers who cared for the animals used in chariot races. Among them were performers, acrobats, jesters, actors, dancers, and animal trainers. They were both admired and despised, tolerated and mocked. Their work provided amusement, yet their profession placed them outside polite society. The law was clear. Actresses could not marry into the senatorial class. They were considered infames, people of bad reputation. But even here, in this forgotten quarter, there were stories of ambition, of survival, of beauty turned into power. In a small cluster of tenements near the hippodrome, a young animal keeper tended the bears used in the races and processions. He worked for one of the factions, perhaps the Greens, perhaps the Blues, and his life was tied to their fortunes. His wife helped manage the performers, sewing costumes, preparing props. To most, they were insignificant, invisible. But one of their daughters would not remain invisible for long. For now, she was only a child, not yet born into the world of colour and noise that would define her. But the stage was already set. Because Constantinople was a city that rewarded those who could read its rhythms, who could dance, speak, flatter, or defy at just the right moment. It was a city that remembered performances long after it forgot names. And when the sun finally rose, striking the gilded crosses of its churches and the marble facades of its palaces, the city shimmered, neither ancient nor modern, but suspended between glory and decay. Every street corner, every doorway, carried echoes of ambition. Fishermen mended their nets with quiet precision. Monks carried bread to the poor. Young boys practiced chariot songs in hopes of joining a faction. The empire's bureaucracy ticked forward like an unseen clock. No one in those early hours could have guessed that within a few decades, this same city would bow to a woman who had once walked among its lowest performers. Theodora's rise was not a miracle, nor a stroke of luck. It was the result of a world that, for all its laws and hierarchies, left just enough cracks for one determined soul to climb through. But to understand her, you must first understand this: the slow pulse of Byzantium, the weight of its traditions, and the way its people survived between splendor and hardship. Every coin gleamed briefly before gathering dust again. Every performance was forgotten by nightfall, and yet, somehow, the city endured. Restless, glittering, and ancient. You can almost hear it now. The faint sound of hammers at the docks, the soft call of the muezzin's precursor, a deacon chanting from a rooftop, and the laughter of a few children chasing each other in a sunlit courtyard. Constantinople is awake. The empire stirs. And somewhere, unseen, a thread of destiny begins to weave its way through the noise, and the gold and the dust, toward a girl who would one day change it all. But how does such a life begin? How does a child of performers learn to survive in a city that worships power and despises poverty? You hear the sound of hooves before you see anything, the rhythmic clatter echoing through the stone corridors beneath the hippodrome. The smell follows: straw, sweat, and oil. The air is warm here, heavy with the scent of animals and torch smoke. Somewhere above, the stands rise like cliffs, empty now, but waiting for the roar that will come with the next race. It is here, in this underworld of the city's great theatre, that Theodora's story begins. She was born, according to most accounts, around the year 500, in these crowded quarters near the hippodrome. Her father, Acacius, kept bears for one of the racing factions, most likely the Greens. It was not a glamorous position. He tended the animals used for parades and occasionally for brutal shows staged between races. His pay depended on the mood of faction leaders, and when the animals grew sick or the crowd restless, men like him were easily replaced. Yet to a child, this world must have seemed enormous. Theodora would have grown up surrounded by color, sound, and movement. Performers rehearsing dances in the dust, musicians tuning lyres, costume makers shouting for thread and needles, dancers practicing hand gestures that imitated gods and lovers from ancient plays, long forgotten by scholars but still beloved by the crowd. The hippodrome was not only for chariots. Between races, it hosted acrobats, mimes, and pantomimes, performances halfway between theatre and dance, where gestures carried more meaning than words. Women could perform, but the price of visibility was steep. In Byzantine moral thought, actresses were considered morally suspect, almost synonymous with courtesans. And yet, they earned coins, admiration, even gifts from nobles who would never speak their names aloud in polite company. Theodora's mother, according to the historian Procopius, a man who despised her but preserved invaluable details, was a dancer herself. She worked with other performers to entertain the crowds, moving between the smaller theatres and the private banquets of wealthy patrons. It was a precarious life. One week there was food and laughter, the next, hunger and silence. When Acacius died, trampled perhaps or dismissed, the family's world narrowed further. Theodora's mother, left with 3 daughters, did what many widows of her class had to do. She begged the faction to keep her late husband's job for one of her children. Procopius describes a scene that sounds almost theatrical. The widow, dressed in the simple, bright costume of a dancer, carrying her children, went before the Greens, pleading for them to hire her husband's replacement from among her little ones. The crowd laughed. The faction refused. Desperate, she turned to the Blues, the rival faction, and asked the same favor. The Blues, perhaps out of pity or rivalry, granted her request. From that day onward, Theodora's household would be loyal to the Blues. It was a small decision, but it bound her fate to one of the most powerful political machines in the empire. In the world of Constantinople, factions were not mere sports teams. They had patrons, networks, and influence deep in the palace. Their members could rise, slowly, dangerously, from obscurity to proximity with power. Theodora's early years were not easy, yet they were full of education, of a kind that no school could teach. She learned how crowds moved, how voices changed when they pleaded or commanded, how silence could say more than words. She watched her mother barter, flatter, argue, and survive. She also watched the women of her neighborhood, actresses, washerwomen, midwives, street sellers, each performing their own version of endurance. Some grew old quietly, others disappeared, swallowed by the city's indifference. Theodora, even as a child, must have noticed which gestures earned favor and which provoked scorn. In the evenings, after the races ended, the hippodrome emptied into the narrow streets. The lights of taverns flickered. Music drifted out, flutes, laughter, a bit of song. Theodora would have heard stories of emperors, saints, and demons told by tired performers sharing bread and wine. The city above them glittered with the gold of the palace, but down here, everything was measured in smaller things. One meal, one favor, one night's applause. There was a theatre near the harbour, wooden, half collapsed, where Theodora likely first stood on stage. She was still a child, perhaps reciting a few lines or dancing in the background of a pantomime. The crowd was not gentle. They shouted, laughed, threw coins, sometimes insults, but she learned. She learned to keep her balance when the stage floor creaked, to smile when the torches smoked, to make a gesture linger just long enough for the front rows to see. It was an apprenticeship in survival. By adolescence, she was already part of the performers' circuit that moved between taverns, private houses, and the small wooden theatres of the city. Her roles were minor, but her presence was sharp, deliberate. She had begun to understand that beauty faded quickly, but wit lasted longer. The life of an entertainer was unstable and regulated. Byzantine law placed actresses and dancers in the same category as prostitutes, legally forbidden to marry senators or hold certain rights. Yet they could accumulate wealth, lovers, and connections that sometimes rivaled those of the nobility. Every night, Theodora saw that contradiction, how the same men who condemned her profession sought her company afterward. The hypocrisy was not lost on her. Some historians suggest she may have been educated informally, learning to read or write Greek through association with educated patrons or clerics who frequented the theatres. Whether she could read the scriptures herself or listen to others read them aloud, the language of theology and empire was already around her, the talk of salvation, sin, and redemption echoing through the city's churches. And so she grew, between piety and performance, between hunger and applause. Outside her window, the world kept shifting. The old emperor, Anastasius, died. Justin I, a soldier from the Balkans, took the throne. His nephew Justinian, clever and ambitious, began to climb through the ranks. The empire was changing, its laws, its faith, its ambitions. But for now, in the cramped alleys near the Hippodrome, such news was only gossip. Theodora's concerns were smaller: a clean costume, a paying crowd, a place to sleep without rats. There is a certain kind of intelligence born from instability, the ability to read danger quickly, to charm without revealing, to adapt before anyone else realizes you have changed. Theodora was learning all of this long before she set foot in a palace. She learned how to speak softly when others shouted, how to hold someone's gaze just long enough to make them listen, how to survive in a city that rewarded those who could entertain it, even as it pretended to despise them. The curtain of her world was not velvet, but linen, patched and smoke-stained. Yet behind it, she began to imagine something larger, a life not defined by laughter or scorn, but by command. Perhaps she did not yet know what form that command would take, but she knew already that she could not remain a performer forever, and so, as the crowds cheered above and the factions plotted in their stands, a young girl beneath the Hippodrome began to plan, not for the next performance, but for escape. The question that would shape her life was not whether she could rise, but how far, and at what cost. By the time Theodora was old enough to perform on her own, Constantinople had grown louder. The city's population swelled with traders from Egypt, grain merchants from Syria, monks from Cappadocia, and soldiers returning from distant borders. The narrow streets near the harbour smelled of salt, fish, and tallow lamps. The constant murmur of work, the rhythmic tapping of cobblers, the hissing of irons in dye shops, formed a steady hum beneath the life of the capital. For those who lived by entertainment, this bustle was both promise and threat. Crowds meant coin. Crowds also meant competition. Theodora's world was made of temporary things: small wooden stages erected beside taverns, a few benches, oil lamps hanging from ropes. The air inside these places was thick, a mixture of smoke, perfume, and cheap wine. People came to laugh, to forget, to see something beautiful in a life that offered little beauty. In such places, reputations were fragile. A stumble, a forgotten gesture, a dull performance. Any of these could end a career. Yet those who could hold an audience's attention, even for a moment, gained power of a peculiar kind. Theodora had that power. Contemporary writers, even those hostile to her, agree that she was captivating. Procopius, whose secret history mixes scandal with resentment, describes her performances as daring, scandalous, and unforgettable. He wrote to discredit her, but in doing so, he preserved a truth, that she commanded attention in a way few others could. The art of pantomime in Byzantium was unlike modern theatre. The performers spoke little or not at all. The story was told through dance, expression, and gesture, movements drawn from ancient myths and romances. Music played from behind the scenes, and the audience, already half drunk, followed along through emotion rather than logic. It was, at its heart, communication without words, an art of presence, of reading faces and echoing desire. Theodora learned early that the boundary between performer and spectator was porous. Nobles and senators attended the shows, as did sailors and beggars. All watched the same scenes but drew different meanings from them. A senator might see a moral warning, a dockworker might see defiance. She was, to both, something dangerous, a woman who could make silence speak. Her performances brought her patrons, and her patrons brought her access to new circles. The line between actress and companion was thin. Many entertainers survived as courtesans. Theodora navigated that space with a mixture of charm and calculation. She accepted gifts, fine fabric, jewelry, sometimes even property. But she also learned how to refuse when refusal had more value than acceptance. In the quiet hours after performances, the city changed character. The grand avenues emptied. The Maze, which had been full of chariots and shoppers, grew dark. Torches flickered beside doorways. The smell of extinguished lamps drifted through the alleys. It was then, walking home through the uneven cobblestones, that Theodora would have seen the true face of Constantinople. The beggars sleeping beside the colonnades, the stray dogs searching for scraps, the shadows of soldiers guarding palace gates. The city was beautiful from a distance, but up close it was a patchwork of survival. Theodora's neighborhood near the Hippodrome was always alive at night. Women sold fruit and bread until dawn. Musicians played near fountains. The factions, men, the blues and greens, sometimes fought drunken skirmishes that left broken benches and bruised egos scattered across the street by morning. Inside the homes, life was narrow and repetitive. Water had to be fetched daily from the nearest fountain. Oil was precious. Bread was rationed. Rats were constant. Theodora's hands, though accustomed to silks on stage, also learned the feel of coarse cloth, of washing, of sweeping. She was not yet powerful. She was practical. There were stories among the performers of women who escaped, who caught the eye of a merchant, or travelled abroad with a governor, or found some other path beyond the stage. Some tales ended in comfort, others in disappearance. Theodora listened, weighed them, and remembered. For every performer who rose, 10 were forgotten. Still, she performed. Each gesture, each look, each turn of her hand was part of a long apprenticeship in persuasion. Beyond the Hippodrome and the theatres, Constantinople was changing again. Emperor Justinian, an old man by now, relied heavily on his nephew, Justinian, a man educated in law and theology, obsessed with order and reform. Few outside the palace cared about these shifts, but they rippled through the city's lower ranks. Faction leaders courted favor with the future emperor. Bureaucrats tightened control over taxes and markets. Life became slightly more regimented, slightly more anxious. In times of transition, performance often becomes sharper. People crave distraction when politics grows uncertain. Theodora's art, half dance, half survival, thrived in that tension. It is possible, though not certain, that she began to perform privately for higher-ranking patrons. Some accounts place her in the company of nobles or governors, others in small domestic theatres where songs and recitations replaced formal pantomime. Each performance was a negotiation between pleasure and control, dependence and dignity. And through it all, she watched. She watched how powerful men spoke when they believed they were unseen, how they weighed flattery, how they feared mockery, how their wives and attendants maneuvered behind them. In a city ruled by ceremony, Theodora learned the hidden grammar of influence. The stage for her was never only about applause. It was training, for observation, for restraint, for understanding what moved people more deeply than laws ever could. Her life might have continued this way indefinitely had she been content. But Constantinople was a city that wore its contempt for actresses openly. Even those who admired her work would whisper against her afterward. Respectability remained forever out of reach. At some point, the endless cycle, performance, laughter, exhaustion, began to feel like a trap. And so, sometime in her late teens, or early 20s, Theodora left the city. Sources disagree about why. Some say she followed a provincial official named Hesebulus, who took her as a companion when appointed to North Africa. Others suggest she sought patronage abroad. Whatever the reason, she boarded a ship and sailed across the Mediterranean, leaving behind the only world she had ever known. It was a small act in the eyes of history, but a profound one for her. To leave Constantinople was to step outside the empire's heartbeat, into a landscape of uncertainty. For a performer born beneath the roar of the hippodrome, the silence of the sea must have been both terrifying and liberating. The journey would not go as she hoped, but it would teach her more about power, faith, and survival than any stage ever could. And it would set her on the long, winding road that would one day lead back to the palace gates she once passed as an unseen child. You can almost hear the creaking of the ship. The wooden hull groans as it shifts against the waves of the Mediterranean. The air is hot and heavy with the smell of salt and pitch. Somewhere below deck, jars of oil and grain roll gently against one another with each sway. Theodora stands near the stern, her hair pulled back, her eyes fixed on the line of water behind them, the receding shape of Constantinople fading into the haze. The domes, the towers, the hippodrome's curved edge, all slowly shrinking into memory. She is young, perhaps 20, her future uncertain. The man beside her, Hesebulus, a provincial governor or official, represents both promise and risk. He is older, powerful enough to command her passage, but not powerful enough to guarantee her safety. His position will take him to Pentapolis, a region along the North African coast, between Cyrene and Tripoli. For him, Theodora is a companion, an adornment for a posting far from the capital. For her, he is a path away from the narrow alleys of the hippodrome. The journey from Constantinople to Africa was long. The ship hugged the coastline, stopping at Rhodes, Crete, perhaps Alexandria. At each port, new passengers boarded, traders, soldiers, monks, and the rhythm of travel continued. The lifting of anchors, the creaking of ropes, the endless horizon. At night, the sea was quiet except for the sound of water brushing the hull. The stars above were vast, more numerous than those visible from any city. Theodora, accustomed to lamps and smoke, would have seen them as cold, unfamiliar eyes. There is no record of what she thought during that voyage. But it is easy to imagine the mixture of hope and unease. To leave Constantinople was to leave the empire's heart, its language of power, its familiar cruelties. Yet exile, voluntary or otherwise, was also a kind of freedom. No one here knew her reputation. No one whispered about her past. The coastline of North Africa appeared slowly. Low hills, patches of olive trees, dry wind. The cities were smaller, quieter, their buildings sun-bleached and square. Markets smelled of spices and dust. Greek was still spoken, but the rhythms were slower, the accents softer. For a time, Theodora lived as the companion of Hesebulus, sharing his house, following him to banquets, appearing at official gatherings. She would have worn finer clothes than she ever had in Constantinople, but fine cloth cannot hide imbalance. When power depends on another's favor, comfort is always temporary. Accounts say that Hesebulus eventually grew tired of her. Perhaps there was a quarrel, perhaps simply neglect. He dismissed her, leaving her stranded far from home, with no protection, no patron, and no means to return. It was not the first time a woman had been cast aside. It would not be the last. But for Theodora, it was a turning point, the moment when survival became an act of defiance rather than endurance. North Africa in the 520s was a harsh place. The Byzantine hold there was fragile, caught between tribal confederations and lingering Vandal influence. Food was scarce. Roads were dangerous. To be alone, foreign and female, was to be constantly at risk. Yet somehow, she managed. There are stories, part rumor, part record, that she made her way eastward, traveling with caravans and traders through the deserts and along the coast. She may have passed through Cyrene, then into Egypt. Each stop brought new hazards, but also small acts of generosity, a loaf of bread from a farmer, a place to sleep in a monastery courtyard, a coin from a merchant who found her courage remarkable. Travel in that age was not like travel now. Every mile was uncertain. Roads disappeared after storms. Wells dried up. Officials demanded bribes. Bandits waited in the hills. Most people never ventured beyond their province. Theodora crossed continents. She must have walked for long hours beneath a relentless sun, her sandals wearing thin, her clothes turning the color of dust. The sea would have shimmered to her left, the desert to her right, the horizon unmoving. For a time, she lived in Alexandria. The city was unlike any other, a blend of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish and Christian influences, full of arguments, sermons and trade. Philosophers debated in courtyards, monks carried baskets through crowded streets, and the smell of ink and papyrus filled the scribes' quarter. It was here, according to later accounts, that Theodora experienced a transformation. The details are uncertain. Some sources say she sought refuge among Christian ascetics, perhaps near the Church of St. Mary. Others claim she worked as a spinner or servant, supporting herself through small tasks. What is clear is that she changed her life, not through wealth, but through perspective. In Alexandria, she encountered the language of repentance, a theme central to early Byzantine Christianity. The idea that even the most fallen could rise through humility, that moral failure could be remade into spiritual strength. For someone who had lived her life under public judgment, this idea must have resonated deeply. Theodora began to live modestly. She prayed, gave away what little she had, and sought peace in simplicity. Whether her faith was quiet devotion or deliberate self-discipline, it became a foundation. Alexandria was also a city of contradictions. Behind its churches and libraries, political tensions ran high. The Monophysite controversy, a theological debate over the nature of Christ, divided the empire. To many, it was not a matter of abstract doctrine, but of identity and loyalty. Theodora would later become a supporter of the Monophysite cause, using her influence as Empress to protect its followers. Perhaps her sympathies began here, among the exiles and priests she met in Egypt. Time passed, months, perhaps years. At some point, she decided to return to Constantinople. The empire called to her, as it always did to those who had left it. She boarded another ship, smaller this time, and sailed north again, through the Aegean, past the islands, toward the familiar shimmer of domes on the horizon. The city had changed. Justin I was nearing the end of his reign. His nephew Justinian had become the true power behind the throne. The palace was alive with new projects, new laws, and new ambitions. And somewhere in its vast machinery, Theodora, older now, tempered by exile, shaped by hardship, began to find her place again. She returned not as a performer seeking applause, but as a woman who had learned the quiet language of survival. Her beauty remained, but it was her composure that set her apart. She spoke softly, carried herself with restraint, and listened more than she talked. She rented a small room near the palace quarter, working quietly, weaving or spinning, perhaps offering modest entertainments to private households. But unlike before, she seemed content to remain unseen. It was in this period of stillness, between obscurity and destiny, that she would encounter Justinian. A meeting that would change not only her life, but the empire itself. But how does an emperor notice a woman the city had already forgotten? What drew his attention? Chance, rumor, or the quiet strength she had learned in exile? You can picture her there, not as a performer now, not as the girl of the hippodrome's roar, but as a quiet figure moving through narrow, sunlit streets that smell of dust and incense. Alexandria, in the early 6th century, was still one of the largest cities in the world. It had outlived its Ptolemaic kings and Roman prefects, survived earthquakes and fires, and remained a crossroads of everything: trade, learning, and faith. But its beauty was weathered. Its marble had dulled. Its great library was long gone. What remained were its people, fishermen, scribes, monks, dock workers, and endless streams of travellers. It was here, after her dismissal by Hesebulus, that Theodora reappears in the faint record of history. A woman alone, stripped of protection, wandering between markets and courtyards, looking for work, any work. In an empire that judged women by their association with men, she was now without standing, without a name that mattered. And yet somehow she endured. There are fragments of stories told centuries later, that she spun wool, that she lived near the quarter of the Monophysites, that she took to prayer with a severity that startled those who remembered her past. Historians argue over how much of this is true, but the tone of the stories, the way they linger on the smallness of her life, feels believable. In Alexandria, the air itself encouraged reflection. The dry wind off the desert carried a quietness, a kind of fatigue that softened the edges of thought. Even the noise of the port seemed to hum rather than shout. For the first time in years, Theodora could disappear. Imagine her standing at dawn outside a small chapel, the stones still cool from the night, listening to the soft chanting of monks through a half-open door. The sound is slow, repetitive, meant to lull rather than excite. Inside, lamps flicker against painted icons. The smell of oil and wax fills the air. This was the world of repentance, not public spectacle, but private persistence. Repentance, in the Byzantine sense, was less about guilt and more about transformation. It was the act of reordering oneself, of turning from chaos towards structure. It demanded silence, patience, and routine, qualities Theodora had never been allowed to cultivate. But now, stripped of her former life, she learned them out of necessity. To live humbly meant to live attentively. Every loaf of bread had to last. Every task had to matter. If she earned a few copper coins spinning thread, she counted them with the same care a merchant gave to gold. There is something deeply human in that, the slow rebuilding of dignity through ordinary acts. The monks and holy women she met in Alexandria would have spoken often of discipline, of fasting, of charity. They taught that virtue was not born of comfort, but of endurance. And perhaps they saw something in her, the restless intelligence, the fierce will that had survived humiliation and exile. She was no longer the dancing girl from the hippodrome. She was something quieter, more deliberate. The city around her mirrored this transformation. Alexandria was a place where contradictions coexisted. Grand churches built beside crumbling pagan temples, bustling markets set against silent desert monasteries. The streets near the Canopic Way smelled of wine, fish, and parchment. Camels and donkeys crowded the alleys. Above it all, the Pharaoh's lighthouse still stood, one of the last wonders of the ancient world, its flame visible for miles. To Theodora, that light must have seemed both constant and unreachable, a symbol of endurance she could only imitate in small ways. At the same time, the city was restless with theological tension. The debate between the Orthodox and the Monophysites over whether Christ had one nature or two was tearing communities apart. To most people, it wasn't an abstract question. It was about belonging, who spoke for God, who ruled justly, who deserved to lead. The Monophysites, strong in Egypt and Syria, believed the imperial church had strayed into pride. They valued humility, asceticism, and the idea that divinity and suffering could not be separated. Their bishops were often exiled. Their monks lived on little more than bread and water. Theodora, living among them, absorbed this language of quiet rebellion. They too were outsiders, dismissed, punished, and misunderstood. She understood that feeling well. In later years, she would become one of their greatest protectors, using her influence in Constantinople to shelter their leaders. But that alliance was not born in politics. It began here, in the dusty courtyards of Alexandria, among people who taught her that humility could be a weapon, and that patience could alter the course of history. At night, the city cooled, the alleys darkened, and the sounds softened. The creak of wooden shutters, the bark of dogs in the distance, the slow lap of waves against the docks. Theodora would have slept lightly, perhaps on a mat near an oil lamp, the flame dancing in the draught. Her dreams were likely of movement, of roads and ships, of faces she no longer remembered. There is something quietly powerful about imagining her in those nights, unremarked, unprotected, yet still unbroken. For most people, history forgets such intervals. We remember rulers, wars, and decrees, not the long silences between them. But those silences are where people change. Theodora's silence in Alexandria lasted long enough for the city to mark her, to soften her ambitions, but sharpen her resolve. And when the time came to leave, she did so not as a performer or exile, but as a person who had learned to live without being seen. Her passage back north would have been quiet. Another ship, another set of stops, perhaps Cyprus, perhaps Antioch, before finally the faint glimmer of Constantinople returned to the horizon. But she was not the same woman who had left it. The streets of the capital were still noisy, the palace still distant. But now she knew patience, she knew endurance, and she knew, most of all, how to move through a world that rarely forgave. She would return to that world soon, unnoticed at first, but destined to stand beside the empire's most powerful man. Still, one question lingers, like the sound of the sea after a ship has passed. When she stepped once more onto the stone quays of Constantinople, did she feel she had come home? Or did she already know she would never truly belong anywhere again? The ship arrived at dawn. Theodora stood among the merchants and sailors on the deck watching as the first light fell over Constantinople. Harbour, the golden horn spreading out like a mirror of molten brass, the walls of the city catching a faint blush of pink. After years of absence, the skyline must have seemed both familiar and foreign. The domes of the churches, the slender watchtowers, the slow movement of cranes at the docks. Everything appeared calm from a distance. But the city had changed. It was always changing. The reign of Justin V was nearing its end. His nephew, Justinian, the emperor-to-be, already governed much of the empire's daily affairs. New laws were being written, new projects announced, and rumors of vast construction plans circulated through the streets. For someone like Theodora, this was not a time of spectacle, but of opportunity. Quiet, subtle opportunity, the kind that comes only to those who can see what others ignore. She entered the city not as the famed performer she once was, but as an anonymous traveler. No one greeted her. No one whispered her name. She rented a small room in a modest neighborhood near the palace quarter, close enough to the power that ruled the world, but still distant from its notice. Her possessions were few. A bundle of clothes, perhaps a spindle, and whatever she had saved from her journey. In those early days, she took work where she could find it. Some sources say she spun wool. Others suggest she may have served in private homes or sold small cloths in the marketplace. To weave was not only to earn a living, it was to recover a rhythm, a steady, repetitive act that mirrored the patience she had learned in exile. In the small rooms where women worked, the air was thick with lint and the smell of oil lamps. The sound of thread being pulled and twisted filled the hours. The work was monotonous, but it demanded precision. A single uneven thread could ruin an entire bolt of fabric. In this monotony, Theodora found discipline. Every morning she rose before dawn, washed in cold water, and began again, turning fiber into thread, thread into cloth. Her hands, once trained for performance, now learned stillness. Each day was the same, and yet each day brought her closer to something unknown. Outside, the city moved at its usual rhythm. The streets around the forum bustled with traders shouting prices. Water carriers called out their routes. Bread sellers hawked loaves, still warm from the ovens. Theodora would have passed them quietly, wrapped in a plain shawl, her face half shadowed. To the city, she was invisible, but invisibility can be a kind of strength. The same skill that once let her hold an audience's gaze now helped her study people without being seen. She watched how officials walked, how servants whispered to one another, how rumors traveled through the streets. She learned which doors mattered and which could be ignored. Slowly, she began to move through the city with purpose. visiting the baths, the small shrines, the markets where the palace servants shopped. Constantinople was a place where information flowed more freely than gold, and Theodora listened. Somewhere in these quiet years, she encountered the circle of women who served the Empress, attendants, hairdressers, and widows attached to the court. They moved between the public and private worlds of the palace, carrying messages, gossip, and advice. Perhaps one of them noticed Theodora's poise, her careful speech, her restraint. Even in simplicity, she carried herself differently. Not like a worker, but like someone who understood the language of performance and dignity both. The court was always in need of such women. Through these connections, she began to re-enter the edges of elite society. Small gatherings, perhaps. The kind held in the shaded courtyards of noble houses, where guests discussed politics beneath the hum of fountains. She did not speak much. She listened. At some point, we do not know how, she met Justinian. He was already powerful then, the adopted nephew and chief advisor of the aging emperor. He was known for his meticulous nature, his long hours of study, and his obsession with order. Where others saw an empire full of flaws, Justinian saw a system that could be perfected through law, architecture, and faith. But he also lived mostly in the company of men who flattered or feared him. Theodora was something different. Their first conversation, unrecorded but imagined through the echo of later years, might have been simple. She may have spoken to him not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She understood performance, but this was no act. She had lived too long among the indifferent and the cruel to waste words. Justinian, for all his intellect, was drawn to certainty. Theodora possessed it. Their connection deepened. He began to visit her modest home. They spoke for hours, perhaps of theology, perhaps of justice, perhaps of the small hypocrisies that governed court life. He found in her what the empire rarely offered him: clarity. And she, in turn, found someone who saw her not as an object of desire, nor a penitent to be pitied, but as a mind to be listened to. Still, their relationship was scandalous. The law forbade senators from marrying actresses. Even if Theodora had abandoned her old life, her past was known. But Justinian was not easily dissuaded. He appealed to his uncle, the emperor, to change the law. And in time, it was changed. A new decree allowing former performers to marry into higher ranks, provided they had lived in virtue thereafter. It was a small adjustment in the legal code, buried among hundreds of others, but it was a turning point in history. Theodora's quiet years, the weaving, the discipline, the humility, had not been wasted. They had prepared her to stand beside the empire's most ambitious man. Yet one cannot help but wonder, when she looked at the walls of the palace for the first time as his betrothed, did she feel triumph? Or did she already sense how heavy the crown's shadow would be? The city was uneasy with the news. Whispers began in the colonnades of the great palace, drifted through the marble corridors of the Senate, and eventually reached the narrow streets of the capital. Justinian, the emperor's nephew, the man who would soon rule the empire, had taken an actress as his companion. Theodora. No name in Constantinople carried more history, more rumor, or more quiet disbelief. Those who remembered her from the hippodrome years spoke in low voices. Some pitied Justinian, others admired his defiance. But in the palace, where rank and reputation were guarded like gold, her name caused unease. Still, Justinian was unmoved. He had spent his life surrounded by scholars, generals, and clerics. He respected intellect and order more than lineage. Theodora, once dismissed as a spectacle, possessed both an order of mind and a composure that few others did. Before they could marry, however, the law had to be rewritten. In the Byzantine Empire, the Codex Theodosianus still contained old Roman restrictions. Actresses and performers, those who had appeared on stage or in public exhibitions, were forbidden to marry senators or men of the highest class. It was a way of preserving the social barrier between the respectable and the disgraced. But Justinian had already begun his great legal project, the compilation and reform of Roman law. He used that machinery to carve out a single precise exception. A new decree was issued, likely around the year 525. It stated that women who had abandoned their shameful profession and lived in good and modest manner might, through imperial mercy, be allowed to marry within the upper ranks. It was a law written for one person. The Senate objected, of course. Some members called it a corruption of custom, an embarrassment to the empire, but Justinian's will prevailed. And so, Theodora, once the daughter of a bearkeeper, once a performer on the Hippodrome sands, became the lawful wife of the man who would soon rule the Byzantine world. Their wedding, though not grand by imperial standards, would have been carefully arranged. The ceremony likely took place in one of the palace chapels, or a church close to the Augusteum. The scent of incense filled the air. Lamps burned before gold icons. The priest recited the prayers that bound not only two souls, but two worlds, the world of law and the world of faith. Theodora stood beside Justinian, calm and still. The city that once mocked her would now bow to her. Yet there is no record of triumph in her demeanor. Those who later described her spoke of gravity, restraint, and an unsettling clarity of gaze, as though she had already measured what lay ahead. After the ceremony, life changed in quiet but decisive ways. She moved into the palace complex, that labyrinth of halls, courtyards, and marble chambers that sat on the edge of the sea. It was a place of silence and suspicion. Servants who vanished between orders, scribes who whispered what they saw. Theodora adapted immediately. She learned the routes through the gardens, the timings of the guards, the faces of those who smiled too quickly. She understood instinctively that the palace was not a home, but a theatre, a place where appearance was protection. Her quarters were modest at first, but they overlooked the Bosporus. From there she could see the ships moving like shadows across the water, their sails catching the faint light of dawn. It was a constant reminder that the empire's reach stretched far beyond the city, from Spain to Syria, from the Danube to the deserts of Africa. At Justinian's side, she began to attend private councils, though not officially recorded. She listened more than she spoke, but her presence was noted. Her opinions, offered quietly, often matched Justinian's instincts so precisely that his advisors began to refer to them as one mind in two bodies. She was not yet Empress. Justinian still reigned, though age had dimmed his faculties. But within the palace, everyone knew the transition was near. Justinian controlled policy, finance, and appointments, and Theodora, through him, began to shape the tone of the court. She established herself not through charm, but through discipline. Servants learned quickly that she demanded silence, precision, and respect. She rose before sunrise, spent hours in prayer, and received only those with purpose. To the noble women of the city, she was a riddle, a woman of low birth who carried herself like a queen. Some envied her, others despised her. Few understood her. But Theodora had no illusions about their regard. She had been mocked before, publicly, brutally. The cruelty of words no longer reached her. Her strength was not loud. It was the kind that held still when others flinched. Outside the palace walls, the empire itself trembled. Famine in the provinces, unrest among soldiers, and the constant threat of Persian raids filled the reports that arrived daily. Yet Justinian's focus remained fixed. He was preparing to consolidate power fully, to become emperor in name as well as in function. Theodora waited, and when the time came, in the year 527, when Justin I died, and Justinian ascended the throne, she stood beside him not as an ornament, but as his equal in ceremony. The coronation took place in the Hagia Sophia, still the old basilica that would later be rebuilt after the Nika riots. The crowd was immense. Incense clouded the air. Golden cloth shimmered in the candlelight. The patriarch placed the crown upon Justinian's head, and then turning, placed another upon Theodora's. For the first time in the history of the empire, an actress wore the imperial diadem. The people cheered, though some voices faltered. Even in joy, disbelief lingered. But Theodora's expression did not change. She accepted the crown with the same calm she had shown when she spun wool in a rented room, when she prayed in Alexandria, when she watched the sea from a ship's deck. It was the same composure, shaped by exile, by hunger, by the long, slow education of survival. That moment marked the beginning of one of Byzantium's most extraordinary reigns, not because of wars or conquests, but because two people, so different in origin, governed as partners. They were bound not by romance, but by purpose. And yet, as the gold crown settled upon her brow, one can almost imagine the thought that flickered in her mind, the same thought that had followed her since the day she left the stage. Would power protect her, or would it, like everything else, demand a price she had not yet paid? The palace did not change overnight. When the last mourning veil for Emperor Justinian was folded away, the same servants moved through the corridors, the same guards stood by the doors, and the same incense drifted through the chapel air. But something invisible had shifted. There were now two centers of power in Constantinople. One, formal and expected, Justinian, Emperor of the Romans, master of armies and law. The other, quieter but no less real, Theodora, Augusta, crowned equal in ceremony, her presence woven into every act of governance. In official mosaics and inscriptions, they appear side by side, holding the symbols of rule. He with a globe and cross, she with a chalice or scroll. But those images capture only a fraction of what their partnership meant. To rule an empire of nearly 50 million souls required endless endurance. Every morning began the same way. Before dawn, the palace corridors filled with the shuffle of sandals and the faint clatter of armor. Candles flickered against the polished marble. In an inner chamber near the Daphne wing, Justinian and Theodora met in private to review the day's petitions. They sat not as monarch and consort, but as two administrators. Documents were unrolled, names read aloud, disputes summarized. Theodora listened in silence. When asked, she spoke briefly, her voice low, deliberate. She rarely contradicted Justinian directly. Instead, she redirected, reframed, clarified. It was said that she had an extraordinary memory, that she could recall the details of a legal case discussed months before, or the name of a widow whose property had been seized by a corrupt official. She kept lists, notes, and small reminders tucked into a box near her writing desk. Her involvement was not ceremonial. Justinian trusted her with decisions that shaped lives, appointments, appeals, and internal discipline. When she issued orders, they were obeyed. Not because of affection, but because she understood hierarchy better than anyone, and never needed to raise her voice to assert it. Outside the palace, her influence extended to the city's social fabric. One of her first acts as Empress was to establish a refuge for women, the metanoia, meaning repentance. It was built on the site of an old palace near the Bosporus and housed hundreds of former prostitutes and destitute girls. They were fed, clothed, and given work in weaving and sewing. It was not an act of sentiment, but of correction. She remembered too well what the city did to women who fell outside its protection. The refuge became a symbol of her reign, mercy tied to discipline. She also intervened in law. Under her urging, Justinian revised sections of the Codex concerning women's rights, tightening penalties for forced prostitution, expanding divorce rights for women suffering abuse, and improving inheritance laws for widows. These were quiet revolutions, written not in speeches, but in parchment. To most citizens, they appeared as small legal notes, but to those who lived under them, they were the difference between ruin and survival. In the grand councils of the empire, Theodora rarely appeared, yet her presence was constant in outcome. Foreign ambassadors remarked that no decision seemed final until she had seen it. Envoys to the Persian court wrote that her influence exceeded that of ministers, though she appeared only rarely in public. Her style of governance differed sharply from Justinian's. He preferred abstract order, laws, systems, architecture, the vast coherence of empire. She preferred human order, the stability of households, the silence of scandal prevented, the loyalty of servants maintained. Together, they formed a balance that neither alone could sustain. In the mornings, Justinian's clerks recorded new decrees. In the afternoons, Theodora received supplicants. Some came with petitions, others with secrets. She listened, observed, and acted quietly. When a court official grew too ambitious or a noblewoman began whispering against her, the Empress moved with precision. A reassignment here, a marriage arranged there, a quiet exile ordered through the prefect. Her power was not loud, it was procedural, administrative, the kind that leaves no signature but shapes every outcome. At night, the palace was still. The candlelight softened the mosaics. The wind brushed through the cypress trees outside the colonnades. Theodora and Justinian often dined alone, their table small despite the scale of their rule. He spoke of architecture, of domes, of geometry, of the laws he hoped would bring the empire closer to divine order. She spoke of people, of loyalty, of pride, of the thousand small ambitions that threatened that order. Sometimes, in these hours, he read aloud from scripture, his voice steady. She listened, her expression calm, but her thoughts elsewhere. On the courtyards of the metanoia, the petitions on her desk, the balance of power that had to be maintained without ever appearing fragile. To the outside world, they were inseparable. Two bodies sharing one soul, as one chronicler wrote. But that unity required constant vigilance. Each had learned that rule was a kind of solitude. Theodora was admired but never loved, feared but not hated, not yet. She moved through the palace like a figure carved in marble, serene, unyielding, and entirely aware of how much the world depended on her remaining both. Still, even within this perfection of ceremony, shadows gathered. The city beyond the walls was restless. The factions of the hippodrome, the blues and the greens, grew increasingly violent, their rivalries spilling into the streets. Taxes were heavy, reforms unpopular. Whispers of dissent reached even the guarded corridors of the palace. For the first time since her coronation, Theodora sensed the rhythm of the city shifting beneath her. The same rhythm she once knew from the stage, that subtle tremor before the audience turns. And perhaps she wondered, as the sound of distant shouts echoed faintly through the night air, would the empire that she and Justinian had built together hold firm against the crowd? Or had their two thrones already begun to tremble beneath the weight of history? Would you like to continue to Section 9, the riot of the blues and greens? You said yes. Continue to Section 9. The riot of the blues and greens, ChatGPT said. Perfect. Now, we step into one of the most violent, pivotal weeks in Byzantine history, when sport, politics, and class anger fused into a storm that nearly ended Justinian's reign. This is Section 9, the riot of the blues and greens. The tone remains calm and observational. You are not in the chaos, but watching it unfold slowly, like a distant fire viewed from across the water. It's a story of noise, of silence, and of how Theodora, once an entertainer in the very hippodrome that now burned, refused to run. In Constantinople, loyalty was a colour. Blue and green, two hues that once marked racing teams in the hippodrome, had long outgrown their sport. They had become emblems of identity, of faith, of social standing. Every citizen belonged to one or the other, by family, by street, or by chance. The blues were the party of orthodoxy, merchants, and the old aristocracy. The greens, more radical, artisans, dock workers, and those who lived closer to the city's edge. Each race day in the hippodrome was less a contest than a ceremony of allegiance. The chariots thundered, the crowd shouted, and above them all, the Emperor's box gleamed with gold leaf and glass tesserae, the imperial couple watching the people, and the people watching them. Theodora, from her seat beside Justinian, would have known every chant, every gesture, every shifting mood. She had once stood down there, in the dust, beneath those same gazes. By the year 532, tension in the city had been growing for months. Heavy taxation had strained merchants. Famine in the countryside had pushed refugees into the capital. Corruption among city officials spread like damp through plaster, invisible, until the walls themselves began to crumble. Then, one winter evening in early January, 2 men, one blue, one green, were sentenced to execution for murder committed during a riot. The hangman failed his task. Both men escaped to sanctuary in a nearby church. Ordinary justice might have ended there. But the city was waiting for a spark. Crowds gathered. Pleas for mercy rose from both factions. Justinian, urged by his advisors to show firmness, refused to pardon them. The Hippodrome, that vast bowl of stone and dust, became a chamber of outrage. On the morning of January 13th, the races began. Justinian took his seat in the imperial box, the kathisma, high above the spina where the chariots would pass. Theodora sat beside him, motionless, veiled in silk the colour of deep sea. The sun glinted off the bronze statues of heroes long dead. The first race began with the usual roar of the crowd. The second, louder. But soon, the cheers turned to chants. "Nika!" they shouted. "Conquer!" At first it seemed like the usual cry for victory. Then it spread, uniting blue and green in one voice. "Nika!" The sound rolled upward like a wave. Then came the first stone. Within hours, the city erupted. Fires broke out near the Augustine. The crowd surged through the colonnades, overturning carts, breaking open prisons, setting the praetor's office alight. The great bronze doors of the Senate Hall were battered down. The blues and greens, for the first time in memory, fought on the same side, not against each other, but against the government itself. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. Justinian's guards held the palace gates. The Senate, many of whom disliked his reforms, began to whisper of replacing him with a new emperor, Hypatius, a nephew of Anastasius. The city's grain stores were looted. The sky filled with smoke so dense that even the sun disappeared. Inside the palace, fear spread quietly. Ministers packed their belongings. Officials urged the emperor to flee by sea, to the safety of Thrace. Ships were readied. It was in this moment, amid panic, indecision, and the sound of shouting from beyond the walls, that Theodora spoke. The chronicler Procopius records her words, though his account may be shaped by admiration or fear. Still, they echo through history. "My lords," she said, her voice calm but cutting through the noise, "flight is not for emperors. If you wish to go, there is the sea, the ships, the open road. But as for me, I stay. The purple is a fine shroud." There was silence. Those who were there remembered that Justinian did not look at her, only at the floor. He said nothing for a long while. Then he ordered his generals to act. Belisarius, the young general of the east, and Mundus, the commander of the palace guard, gathered their men. They blocked the exits of the Hippodrome, where the rebels, some 30,000 of them, had gathered, expecting a new emperor's coronation. The doors were barred. What followed was slaughter. The soldiers entered from all sides, their blades flashing in the dim torchlight. The roar of the crowd became a scream, then silence. When dawn came, the dust of the Hippodrome was soaked dark. The exact number of dead is unknown. Some say 20,000, others more. When the smoke cleared, Justinian still sat upon his throne. Theodora's composure never broke. While the bodies were cleared and the fires extinguished, she returned to her duties. Petitions continued. Orders were signed. No gesture of triumph, no word of remorse, only the steady continuation of rule. The city was rebuilt. Justinian used the ashes as foundation for new projects. The Basilica of Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in the Christian world, rose from the ruins of the revolt. Its domes were said to float like heaven itself, shimmering above the city that had nearly destroyed itself. Theodora oversaw its decoration, selecting mosaics, approving artisans, ensuring that her presence, though not depicted, would be remembered in its gold. From that moment, her authority became unchallengeable. She had not commanded the troops, but she had commanded the will to remain. For those who survived, the riot became a whisper, a warning passed through generations of how close empire came to collapse, and how a woman who once danced beneath the Hippodrome's arcades refused to let it fall. Years later, the scars remained. You could still see the outlines of burned marble along the colonnades, the patches of new stone beside old. The citizens learned to speak more softly when discussing power. And yet, beneath the new domes and mosaics, something else had changed. A subtle fear, perhaps, or respect. The people of Constantinople no longer saw their rulers as distant figures. They had seen them tested by fire. And in that fire, it was not Justinian who seemed eternal. It was Theodora, the Empress who stayed. Still, the city's silence could not last forever. Beyond the palace, other storms were forming, not in the streets, but in the councils of the church, where new battles over faith and doctrine began to stir. And so one might ask, after surviving riot and ruin, what could threaten Theodora now, if not the people, but the very faith she claimed to defend? When the smoke of the Hippodrome finally cleared, Constantinople returned to its long rhythm: commerce, prayer, decree, silence. Ships came and went from the Golden Horn. The bakeries reopened. The city's 1,000 bells resumed their patterns of morning and evening sound. But beneath the calm, another kind of fire smouldered, one that could not be quenched with soldiers or stone. It began not in the streets, but in the pulpits. For generations, the Byzantine world had been divided over a question so subtle that few could define it, yet so fierce that whole provinces had rebelled because of it: the nature of Christ. Was he one nature, wholly divine, with humanity absorbed into divinity, as many monks and Eastern bishops believed? Or two, divine and human, distinct but united, as the imperial church had declared at Chalcedon? It was a matter of language, but also of empire. To accept one formula was to affirm Constantinople's authority. To reject it was to side with Egypt, Syria, Armenia, provinces where Monophysite Christianity, the one nature faith, ran deep. And Theodora, who had lived among these people, who had once found refuge in Alexandria, remembered. While Justinian upheld orthodoxy, she quietly built networks of protection for those condemned as heretics. Monks and bishops fleeing persecution found sanctuary in her palaces. She housed them discreetly, often within the women's quarters of the great palace itself, spaces no official dared enter without her permission. It was said that she transformed one of her private residences into a hidden monastery, where priests recited the forbidden liturgy. There at night, lamps flickered against the marble walls, while voices whispered prayers no longer permitted in public. Theodora's motives were never simple. Some said compassion, a memory of her own exile and humiliation. Others said calculation, that she sought to keep the Monophysite clergy loyal to her, ensuring that the emperor's enemies might one day become her allies. Perhaps it was both. She had learned that power in Byzantium was not maintained through brute strength, but through quiet balance, between mercy and control, faith and authority, silence and speech. The division of doctrine became for her another tool to manage loyalty. When bishops petitioned the emperor for punishment of heretics, Theodora delayed. She wrote letters urging moderation. She invited certain prelates to dine with her, offering gifts or protection. She spoke softly, never directly opposing Justinian in public, but her influence ran parallel to his. Two currents within the same river, sometimes converging, sometimes colliding beneath the surface. And Justinian knew. He had watched her intervene before, on laws, on justice, on mercy, but theology was different. It was the structure of the empire's soul. Yet he did not confront her. Instead, he adjusted his own policies, oscillating between tolerance and enforcement, issuing decrees that seemed to please neither side entirely. Behind closed doors, their debates were long and private. He cited councils and creeds. She cited the suffering of believers. He sought unity through law. she sought it through compassion or control. In these quiet disputes, their partnership deepened and darkened. One evening, as chroniclers later wrote, Theodora summoned Severus of Antioch, the exiled patriarch and spiritual leader of the one nature faith. He arrived in disguise, carried through a side gate of the palace. They spoke for hours, in the soft lamplight of her chamber. No record remains of their words, only the rumor that Theodora promised him protection as long as she lived. When he departed, the guards said she stood for a long while looking toward the sea, the lamps behind her reflected in the black water of the Bosporus. Perhaps she saw herself there, caught between reflection and depth, between faith and power. Her secret interventions spread across the empire. In Egypt, a monophysite bishop regained his seat with her help. In Syria, exiled monks received imperial stipends quietly approved through her hand. Theodora's network of loyalty extended from Constantinople to the Red Sea, invisible but constant. Meanwhile, Justinian's grand project, the codification of Roman law, continued. He saw theology as another form of jurisprudence. Truth written, organized, defined. But faith resisted such clarity. And so, even as his laws unified the empire's courts, his decrees fractured its churches. For the common people, these arguments meant little. Bread, tax, and peace mattered more than councils. Yet even in the markets, one could hear the echoes of the controversy in stray phrases and gestures. A shopkeeper might cross himself differently. A monk might refuse to eat with another. Every gesture had meaning. Every silence, weight. Theodora moved through this atmosphere with deliberate grace. In public, she was the perfect empress, robed, solemn, devoted. In private, she was something else, the quiet protector of a hidden faith. To the clergy she aided, she was a saint. To her husband's advisors, a threat. To herself, perhaps, simply consistent. The same woman who had once known what it meant to be cast out, and who now held in her hand the power to shield others. But protection required secrecy, and secrecy bred suspicion. Rumors began to spread through the court, that the empress kept her own church, that she defied the emperor's decrees, that she sought to crown her faith above his law. Whispers reached the Senate. Reports were written, sealed, sent quietly to the patriarch's office. Some accused her of treason in theology, the most dangerous form of dissent in Byzantium, where heresy was as grave as rebellion. Still, Justinian remained silent. He knew that her influence among the people, and among his own ministers, was too strong to challenge openly. So the empire continued as before. 2 thrones, 2 rulers, 2 visions of salvation. Each morning, they appeared together in public, he with his golden crown, she with her jeweled veil. To the crowd they seemed united, but those who stood close could see the distance between them, a pause too long, a silence too careful. And yet, the empire endured. It endured because both knew that even division, if managed properly, could be a form of stability. Still, the question lingered, whispered in monasteries, debated in candlelight, written in the margins of letters and psalms. If the empire itself could not decide the nature of Christ, what hope did it have of deciding the nature of power? The Byzantium of Theodora's middle years was a city under construction. Everywhere, the sound of chisels, stone against stone, the slow, patient rhythm of an empire remaking itself after fire. Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, rose at the city's center like an unfolding vision. From the upper terraces of the great palace, Theodora could see its dome taking shape, vast and white against the sky. The dust from its building drifted through the streets like pollen, fine, pale, unending. The work began in the spring after the Nika revolt. Justinian had sworn to rebuild the city greater than before. Not as it was, he said, but as it should have been. To most, it was another imperial boast. To Theodora, it was the act of a man haunted by fragility, who sought permanence in stone. The new church consumed everything: gold, marble, men. Shiploads of columns arrived from the temples of Ephesus and Baalbek. Mosaic glass came from Syria, emerald green and honey gold. Builders worked day and night beneath hanging lamps, their bodies powdered with lime. Theodora visited often, veiled and quiet. She spoke to the foreman, approved payments, ensured supplies for the laborers. To them, she was not an empress, but an overseer, practical, exact, unsentimental. She knew that empire, like faith, required maintenance. While Justinian conceived, she ensured execution. He wrote to architects and theologians. She wrote to governors and quartermasters. His vision reached heavenward. Hers kept the ground firm beneath it. Constantinople itself became a mirror of their marriage, a city balanced between splendor and exhaustion. Beyond the grand avenues, life carried on in slower rhythm. The markets reopened, filled with the smell of olives, resin, and bread. The silk workshops, once scandalous, now regulated by imperial law, clattered with looms. Theodora had encouraged domestic production of silk, breaking the monopoly of Persian traders. According to chroniclers, she even arranged for monks to smuggle silkworm eggs from the east, hidden inside hollow walking staffs. Whether the tale is true or not, the effect was real. Byzantium began to weave its own luxury, thread by thread. The silk bore her mark, colours deep as garnet, woven with imperial emblems. These fabrics became the currency of favour. A roll of Theodora's silk meant protection, advancement, gratitude. Within the palace, daily life followed a strict cycle. Theodora's attendants rose before dawn, lighting the lamps of her private chapel. She prayed in silence, not as piety, but as order. Her prayers were as measured as her decrees. Afterward came petitions. Pages entered carrying scrolls tied in red and gold, letters from widows, accusations against officials, reports from the provinces. Each was opened, read aloud, answered. Some required signatures, others only a glance. She rarely displayed emotion. Her authority lay in stillness. The same composure she had once used on stage, now refined into power. And yet, amid the discipline, there were moments of quiet humanity. A letter from a convent near Antioch survives, addressed to the Most Holy Augusta, protector of women. The sisters wrote of famine, of lost flocks, of despair. Theodora's reply was simple: a shipment of grain, a donation of cloth, and an order exempting their land from tax for 1 year. No flourish, no sermon, just intervention. This was her empire: maintenance, adjustment, continuity. While Justinian's eyes turned outward, to Africa, Italy, the dream of reconquering Rome, Theodora looked inward. She knew that conquest meant little without structure to sustain it. In the palace council, she often remained silent through hours of debate, speaking only at the end. When she did, the room shifted. Her words carried the weight of necessity, not brilliance, but endurance. The chronicler John of Ephesus once wrote that Justinian built the empire in marble. Theodora preserved it in silence. That silence was her craft. Outside, the city glittered. Hagia Sophia's dome was completed, vast enough to hold the echo of its own hymns. Mosaics caught the morning light like frozen fire. Pilgrims came from every province to see it, to stand beneath its gold and whisper prayers into its endless space. Yet even in its glory, the city was weary. The taxes that paid for its beauty had drained the countryside. Famine touched the Danube. In distant Egypt, riots flared again between factions of faith. Theodora knew the pattern, that every construction left debris, every triumph its shadow. She had learned to read the empire the way one reads fabric, not by its surface, but by its weave. At night, she sometimes walked the upper galleries of the palace, looking out across the city. The lamps along the harbour burned in long, trembling lines. The sound of hammers drifted faintly from the workshops, still active after dark. From here, Constantinople looked eternal. But she knew better. She knew how quickly applause could turn to riot, how easily devotion could dissolve into doctrine. She had lived both. She understood that the empire's true shape was not its walls or domes, but its endurance, its ability to rebuild again and again from the dust. And perhaps, in that quiet recognition, she felt something like kinship with the city itself. Both magnificent, both scarred, both built from what had once been broken. Still, beneath the marble, the dust gathered. The city's sewers overflowed. Plague rumors began to trickle from Egypt. Ships from Pelusium arrived carrying stories of sickness, of rats, of unseen death moving with the wind. Theodora heard the reports and ordered inspection of the ports. She knew disease, like rebellion, began with whispers. But she also knew how little even an empress could control once the tide began to rise. And so, while the last scaffolds of Hagia Sophia were dismantled and the people celebrated their city of gold, the empire stood unknowingly on the edge of its darkest trial. Because in the spring to come, the dust that filled the air would no longer be marble, but ash and plague, and the measure of mortality itself. It began with rumors from the south. Ships arriving from Egypt spoke of a strange sickness, of sailors found dead in their hammocks, of cargo left untouched in the sun, of ports sealed by fear. At first, Constantinople dismissed it as distant misfortune. The empire had survived famine, riot, and war. What was disease to a city that had rebuilt itself in marble? But by the spring of 541, the first bodies appeared near the harbours of the Golden Horn. Dock workers fell ill, then their families, then the traders who lived above the wharves. The physicians called it fever. The priests called it penance. The people called it phobos, fear. The disease did not move quickly. It drifted like weather. Those who felt its touch described the same beginning: dizziness, swelling in the groin or underarm, a heat that burned without sweat. Then came the silence. Some recovered, most did not. By early summer, it had reached the great palace. Procopius, who served as court historian, recorded what few dared to speak aloud. The emperor himself fell ill. Justinian, once tireless, collapsed into fever. For days, the palace stood still. Officials whispered in the corridors, courtiers packed their belongings, and priests gathered in the chapel to pray for his soul. Theodora remained beside him. She ordered the chambers sealed, the servants dismissed, and sat through long nights beside the imperial bed, not as a nurse, but as a sentinel. When his fever broke, days later, he woke to find her exactly as before, still, watchful, composed. The empire breathed again, but the city did not. The plague had deepened. The streets grew quiet except for the sound of carts, the kind used to carry the dead. At first they came once a day, then hourly, then without pause. The graveyards filled. New trenches were dug beyond the walls. The smell of burning herbs mixed with incense. Chroniclers wrote that at the height of the plague, 10,000 people died each day. Whether that number is truth or exaggeration no longer matters. What mattered was the feeling that the world had slowed to silence. Workshops were empty. The hippodrome stood unused. Ships drifted unmanned in the harbour. Even the bells fell still, for there were no hands left to ring them. Inside the palace, Theodora continued to govern. She issued orders to feed the hungry, to collect and bury the dead, to secure the supply of grain. She commanded that the state pay for every burial, even for slaves, that no body should lie unburied in the streets. When grave diggers themselves began to die, she sent soldiers to dig instead. She forbade the abandonment of the sick, threatening punishment for those who fled their families. Some obeyed, others simply disappeared. Justinian, weakened but alive, resumed rule in fragments. He signed decrees from his bed, his writing hand trembling. Procopius noted that he seemed changed, quieter, more inward, his gaze lingering longer on the icons that hung in his chamber. Perhaps he had looked too closely at his own mortality and seen how small even an emperor was against the scale of nature. Theodora, by contrast, appeared untouched. Those who saw her in those months spoke of her calm, a stillness that unnerved as much as it comforted. She never spoke of fear, never mentioned death. Her attendants said she washed her hands with vinegar after every encounter and never removed the small gold cross she wore beneath her robe. She understood, better than most, that survival often depended on ritual, not faith alone, but repetition. Outside the palace, the city's grandeur decayed. Wealthy homes stood empty. Temples closed. The markets offered nothing but silence. The rats, fat from refuse, moved through the streets unbothered. And yet, life did not vanish. In the ruins of the quarter near the Forum of Theodosius, a baker reopened his oven, offering bread to anyone who could bring wood to burn. A midwife, left alone after her family's death, began tending to the sick with boiled herbs. 2 monks carried the bodies of strangers to burial, day after day, until they too were carried. The empire, reduced to these small acts, persisted. By winter, the worst had passed. The plague ebbed, leaving the city hollowed but alive. The survivors emerged like ghosts, blinking against the light. The population had fallen by nearly half. Entire districts stood abandoned, grass growing between paving stones. Theodora ordered census records updated, tax burdens revised, and new laborers brought from the provinces to rebuild. She also ordered prayers, not for the dead, but for endurance. "We do not ask for mercy," one inscription read, "but for strength." Justinian's recovery marked the beginning of his second reign, not in title, but in tone. He no longer dreamed aloud of conquest. His speeches turned to law, salvation, and the afterlife. Theodora, watching him, understood the change but did not share it. She had never believed that suffering purified the soul, only that it revealed who could act while others waited for deliverance. And so she acted. In the years that followed, she quietly restored the institutions shattered by the plague. The orphanages reopened, the silk looms resumed. Refugees from the countryside were resettled in the empty quarters of the city. To the world beyond, the empire appeared steady again. But those who had lived through the year of the plague carried a new awareness that life, even at its most ordered, could collapse without warning, and that recovery was not a miracle, but a discipline. At night, when the wind moved across the Bosporus, the city smelled faintly of smoke and salt, the scent of what had been burned and what remained. Theodora would sometimes walk alone through the palace gardens, where weeds had begun to reclaim the paths. She touched the leaves absently, as if measuring time by their return. Perhaps she thought of the years before, of the riots, the rebuilding, the endless effort to hold together what was always unraveling. Perhaps she thought of how the plague had shown her what even imperial power could not command. And perhaps she knew, as all rulers eventually do, that endurance itself has a cost, not of blood, but of wear. The empire would recover, but it would never be quite the same. Its marble would gleam again, its prayers resume, its markets fill, and beneath it all, the memory of death would linger like dust. Still, Theodora did not falter. There was work to be done, and new threats already forming, not from plague or riot, but from within the fragile web of court politics that had begun to fray under the strain of loss. And so, as the city healed, she prepared once more to defend what she had built. Because survival, she had learned, was not a single act, but a posture one maintained, even when the world had stopped moving. When the bells of the city rang again, they sounded different, slower, more uncertain. Constantinople was breathing, but faintly. The plague had retreated, leaving empty houses and unclaimed estates. The harbour had reopened, though fewer ships came to anchor there. And within the great palace, the familiar hum of politics had returned, cautious, subdued, but alive. For Theodora, this was the most dangerous time. Empires, she knew, did not fall in the heat of catastrophe. They decayed in the stillness that followed. The court, once united by the crisis of survival, began to fracture along its old fault lines: class, creed, and ambition. The men who had fled the capital during the plague were now returning, healthy, loud, and resentful of those who had governed in their absence. Many of them whispered the same accusation, that the Empress had ruled too long, too freely, while the Emperor was ill. They said she had interfered in matters of theology, dismissed officials, even controlled the treasury. Some added, in quieter tones, that she had done so not to preserve the empire, but to preserve herself. It was not the first time Theodora's authority had been questioned, but this time the air felt thinner. Theodora was older now, 40, perhaps 41. The fire of her youth had cooled into something sharper, patience. She rarely raised her voice anymore. Instead, she waited. Her power lay not in command, but in continuity. While others rose and fell, she remained, an unbroken line through years of crisis. Justinian, still weakened from illness, trusted her judgment more than ever. Yet even his favor could not silence the undercurrents that ran through the court. In the Senate chambers, the old families muttered of succession. In the palace gardens, eunuchs traded information like coin. And in the quiet corners of the Hagia Sophia, priests debated her orthodoxy in cautious, half-spoken phrases. Because beneath politics lay the deeper fracture, theology. The empire was still divided between those who believed Christ had one divine nature and those who held he had two. To the outsider, this might seem a minor difference. To Byzantium, it was everything. Doctrine defined allegiance, faith defined law, and Theodora, to the fury of many bishops, supported the monophysites, those who clung to the one nature belief condemned by Rome. Her palace had become a refuge for exiled clerics from Egypt and Syria. She granted them safety, food, even funds to copy their texts. She did this not out of rebellion, but out of conviction. She remembered the years she had spent in Alexandria, among people who worshipped in secret, who prayed in silence to avoid persecution. Perhaps she saw in them a reflection of her own beginnings, those who survived by bending but not breaking. But tolerance in Byzantium was treason in theological form. When Justinian's advisors urged him to expel the heretics, Theodora quietly blocked their decrees. When a monophysite monk was condemned to death, she had him smuggled out of the city under guard of her personal attendants. She understood that mercy too could be a weapon. And so, as the empire rebuilt itself, Theodora's influence deepened, not through public acts, but through private channels, sealed letters, and whispered favors. Procopius, in his secret history, would later describe this time in venomous terms. He called her cunning, vindictive, power-hungry, a woman who feared neither God nor man. But those who actually saw her at court described something else entirely. Restraint. She listened more than she spoke. She kept notes of every conversation, stored in a small cedar box in her study. She rose before dawn and met with her attendants in silence. The clatter of her footsteps on marble was enough to make guards straighten. Even Justinian deferred to her presence, though he rarely admitted it aloud. Together they ruled, but separately they endured. Justinian, ever the theologian, busied himself with endless councils, seeking unity through words. Theodora, the pragmatist, built alliances through people. She corresponded with bishops in Antioch, merchants in Tyre, and midwives in the city slums. To her, influence was not decreed, it was woven, and yet, threads can tighten into snares. In the spring of 544, a plot emerged. A minor official, arrested for embezzlement, confessed under interrogation that several senators had conspired to replace the emperor with a distant cousin. Their reasoning was simple. Justinian's illness had weakened him, and Theodora's authority had grown intolerable. The names he gave were familiar, men who had once shared her table, who had praised her devotion during the plague. She said nothing when the confession reached her. She only asked for the list to be rewritten in her own hand. That evening, the accused was summoned to the palace. No soldiers stood at the doors. No public trial followed. By morning, 3 of the men had taken vows as monks, exiled quietly to remote monasteries in Cappadocia. The others were never heard from again. To the court, it seemed the Empress had acted swiftly and mercifully. To those who looked more closely, it was a reminder. Power in Byzantium was exercised not by spectacle, but by silence. And yet, even in control, Theodora began to sense the limits of her reach. Justinian had grown more introspective, his nights spent in prayer and his days in dictating edicts. He spoke often of sin, of redemption, of the vanity of earthly things. Sometimes she would find him staring at the mosaics of the palace chapel, at Christ seated in judgment above the golden apse. And she would feel for the first time a distance she could not cross. They had ruled together for 20 years, and yet she saw that their paths had begun to part. His leading toward salvation, hers toward permanence. The court, ever sensitive to change, noticed too. Ambassadors whispered that the Empress was waning in favor. Young nobles began to seek advancement through the Emperor's religious councils rather than through her household. But Theodora did not fade. She adapted. If Justinian would rule the empire of the spirit, she would rule the empire of the living. She focused her efforts on the institutions she had founded. The convents for reformed women, the workshops for silk, the hostels for pilgrims. She visited them quietly, unannounced. She spoke to the workers, the widows, the orphans, and listened to their stories of survival. It was here, among the forgotten, that she felt most at home. Not because she pitied them, but because she understood them. In their endurance, she recognized the truth that had guided her from the theatre to the throne, that power was not inherited. It was accumulated, one necessity at a time. Still, the whispers continued. Procopius was compiling his histories. The senators plotted new alliances. The priests debated her name in sermons they pretended were about others. And in the quiet of her chambers, Theodora sometimes felt the faint chill of decline. Not from age, but from isolation. She had become, at last, what she had always feared and sought, untouchable. Outside, the city she had rebuilt shimmered again in the sun. Inside, shadows gathered, not of rebellion, but of memory. Every ruler she knew became a ghost before death. She had walked from the circus to the palace, from shame to sanctity, and now she stood between two worlds, not fallen, not ascended, simply enduring. And still, one question lingered. When all the enemies were gone, what remained to fight for? By the time the city had recovered from plague and intrigue, the empire had changed in ways that even marble could not hide. The streets were cleaner, the granaries better stocked, the churches more numerous. But beneath the visible renewal, another transformation was taking shape, one not of stone, but of words. It began with Justinian's lifelong obsession, law. The emperor believed that to rule justly was to give shape to chaos. The empire's old legal system, a vast, contradictory web of Roman edicts, senatorial decrees and local traditions, was, in his view, an inheritance too fragile to survive confusion. He dreamed of unity, a single body of law that would outlast cities, dynasties, and even faith itself. So he summoned jurists, scribes, and scholars from across the empire. They met in cold halls lit by oil lamps, surrounded by stacks of aging scrolls, the words of emperors long dead. They worked under the supervision of the most brilliant among them, Tribonian, a scholar from Pamphylia. By Justinian's order, they were to strip the empire's laws of repetition, contradiction, and decay. It was a monumental labor, 20 centuries of Roman thought condensed into coherence. But behind that vision stood another, quieter influence, Theodora. Her name appears nowhere in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the vast compilation that emerged from these efforts. Yet her presence shaped it as surely as the emperor's seal. For while Justinian sought divine order, Theodora sought human mercy. She read the drafts of laws sent to her private chambers, marking them with small, precise notes in the margins. She did not question legal form, only consequence. A proposed law restricting divorce, for example, she rejected outright. A woman, she wrote, should not remain chained to ruin because her husband's cruelty is hidden by custom. When a decree proposed harsher penalties for women accused of adultery, she intervened again. Let not shame be multiplied by law, she added in her careful hand. To Justinian, such concerns seemed worldly. To Theodora, they were survival. She remembered the streets of Constantinople, the women who worked the taverns, the dancers who sold laughter for coins, the servants who had no protection against their masters. She had been all of them once, and she refused to let the empire forget them. Thus, among the thousands of imperial edicts, a few bear traces of her compassion, softened penalties, new protections, small mercies woven into imperial syntax. One law forbade the trafficking of women across provincial borders. Another gave former prostitutes the right to enter convents without permission from their owners. A third abolished the right of husbands to kill adulterous wives. None bore her name, all bore her shadow. In her private audience chamber, a quiet, high-ceilinged room off the Chrysotriklinos, Theodora met with those who would never have reached the emperor: widows, petitioners, merchants, slaves. She sat on a low chair, her attendants standing behind her, and listened. The process was slow, deliberate, without spectacle. She asked questions in a low voice, made notes, and dismissed them with the same words every time. You have been heard. It was not justice in the Roman sense. It was something older, more immediate, a recognition of presence. In Byzantium, where power was both divine and bureaucratic, this human attentiveness became its own form of authority. The chroniclers rarely recorded these sessions. The official histories cared for wars, not hearings. Yet the impact of those quiet mornings rippled through the empire's future, because justice, once rendered, endures differently than stone. Theodora's influence was not confined to compassion alone. She also understood the political weight of law. When factions within the church grew restless, she urged Justinian to legislate moderation. When senators attempted to revive old privileges, she recommended new regulations that limited inheritance through noble titles. And when the city's guilds protested taxation, she suggested reform. Not leniency, but clarity. Ambiguity, she told her secretaries, is the mother of corruption. Her handwriting, elegant but severe, appears on surviving drafts, a rare glimpse of an empress thinking in ink. Still, for all her insight, she remained constrained by formality. Women, even empresses, could not legislate, but she had long learned that influence did not require signature, only persistence. Thus, when Justinian's final revision of the legal code was proclaimed in 534, Theodora's name was never mentioned. Yet in the sections concerning marriage, dowry, and guardianship, her voice murmured between the lines. She had turned the private language of survival into public law. The codex was read aloud across the provinces, in Greek, in Latin, in the local tongues of Armenia and Syria. The people heard the emperor's justice, but in the balance of mercy and control, they also heard the empress's hand. For Theodora, it was not triumph she felt, but recognition of something rarer: permanence. She had lived a life that would not have been preserved by monument or portrait, but by the steady endurance of legal clauses. The very system that would later define Europe carried fragments of her thought, disguised as neutrality. The irony, she might have mused, was exquisite. The former dancer, whose existence had once been outside the law, had become one of its architects. Still, she did not rest in self-satisfaction. Law, she knew, was not morality. It was an arrangement, a balance between power and forgiveness. And even as the new codes spread through the empire, she could sense the limits of what they could contain. A famine in Antioch had led to unrest. The Balkans were restless. In Italy, the war for the reconquest of Rome dragged on, costly, endless. Theodora watched reports arrive daily. Columns of figures, requests for soldiers, lists of the dead. all the laws in the world could not still the motion of empire. At times, she would unroll the great parchment copy of the Corpus Juris, running her fingers over the fine ink. She would pause at certain words, humanitas, aequitas, pietas, and smile faintly at their elegance. They were Roman ideals, preserved and purified. But beneath them lay something she understood better than any scholar, that all law is, finally, an attempt to manage fear. Fear of loss, fear of change, fear of others. She had spent her life managing such fear, and now, in its codified form, she had given it a framework that could outlast her breath. Still, one question returned to her in the long hours after court was dismissed. If the law could preserve the structure of an empire, could it preserve its soul? By the mid-540s, the empire was vast, rebuilt, and tired. Its cities glimmered with marble facades and golden mosaics, but beneath the surface, belief itself was fractured. To live in Byzantium was to live within argument. Every sermon, every procession, every whispered prayer could carry a hint of rebellion, not against the emperor, but against his theology. The question, as it had been for decades, was simple and impossible. Did Christ have one nature or two? For Justinian, this was no mere matter of philosophy. Unity of belief meant unity of empire. A divided faith meant a divided world. For Theodora, it was something else, a question of conscience and of power. She had long sympathized with the monophysites, those who clung to the belief that Christ's divine and human natures were not two, but one. To the imperial court and the Church of Rome, this doctrine was heresy. To the eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Armenia, it was identity. And so, between emperor and empress, an invisible boundary formed. Justinian worked tirelessly to reconcile Rome and Constantinople, issuing decrees, summoning councils, rewriting creeds in careful, exacting Latin. Theodora, meanwhile, worked in silence, maintaining secret correspondence with the exiled bishops and monks who had been driven from their homes. In her palace apartments, she housed them under assumed names. Some disguised themselves as merchants or scholars. She provided them food, stipends, and, most dangerously, a voice. She arranged quiet audiences with sympathetic clergy, using her own attendants as intermediaries. Letters were smuggled out, sewn into the hems of garments, or hidden in baskets of fruit bound for Syria. Few outside her circle understood the scale of this operation. Even Justinian, though not entirely ignorant, preferred not to know the details. It was easier, perhaps, to look away, to pretend unity while his own wife harbored heretics under the same roof. But Theodora did not think in terms of disobedience. She saw herself as protector of those whom the empire had exiled, a role both political and personal. In the monophysites, she saw echoes of her own exile, her own survival against the decrees of men. Their suffering was, in her eyes, a familiar language: silence, endurance, adaptation. One of those she protected was a man named Jacob Baradaeus, a wandering Syrian monk, thin and quiet, with a persistence that outlasted persecution. It was Theodora who gave him shelter, and later, funds to continue his mission. Under her protection, Jacob traveled across the eastern provinces, ordaining priests and bishops in secret, rebuilding the monophysite church from the shadows. To later historians, this quiet network would come to define an entire branch of Christianity, the Jacobite Church, born from exile and endurance. And at its root was Theodora's unseen hand. She knew she could not change the emperor's decrees, but she could ensure that faith itself survived beyond them. The court called her stubborn, the bishops called her dangerous, but the people of Egypt and Syria called her mother. Meanwhile, Justinian wrestled with the impossible task of unity. He summoned theologians to Constantinople, men who argued for days over single words: nature, essence, will. He believed that precision could solve belief, that definition could contain mystery. But faith, Theodora knew, did not yield to law. She watched him grow thinner, more weary, as counsel followed counsel. each ending with compromise that satisfied no one. She did not mock his effort. She only saw, with a quiet inevitability, that he was trying to impose order upon something that thrived in chaos. Sometimes at dusk, when the palace corridors were empty and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and oil, Theodora would walk to the small chapel she had built beside her chambers. There, beneath a mosaic of the Virgin, she prayed, not aloud, but with the stillness of someone who has made peace with uncertainty. Her prayers were not for victory, nor even for unity. They were for endurance, for the faith of the empire to bend but not break, to survive its own argument. In this, she understood something that even her husband did not, that belief is less about truth than about belonging. A creed could divide, but a shared act of worship, a candle lit, a chant repeated, could bind. She began quietly funding new monasteries, not in the capital, but in the provinces, where faith was lived rather than debated. In Syria, she endowed a convent for women who had fled persecution. In Egypt, she supported a small community of monks who copied sacred texts in their native tongue rather than in Greek. It was a subtle defiance, not a challenge to authority, but a preservation of variety. Justinian's vision was a single, perfect church. Theodora's was a living one, imperfect, divided, but enduring. Their differences, though quiet, began to shape the empire's tone. At court, every sermon became a signal, every act of charity a statement. The Patriarch of Constantinople, anxious to please both rulers, learned to phrase his homilies with exquisite ambiguity. And so, Byzantium lived suspended between two convictions, divine unity and human complexity. To an outsider, it seemed a contradiction. To Theodora, it was balance, the very principle that had carried her from the stage to the throne. She did not expect history to remember her theology. She only wanted its consequences to last. The protection of the weak, the tolerance of doubt, the quiet endurance of those whose names would never be written in the codex. By the late 540s, her influence in the spiritual realm was undeniable, even if unspoken. Justinian continued to legislate faith through councils and decrees. But she, with quieter hands, had built a parallel church, a refuge that would outlive them both. It was a dangerous balance. And yet, as she looked out across the Bosporus from her window, watching ships drift toward the southern harbours, she must have known how delicate that web truly was. Because every act of protection carried a shadow of rebellion, and every secret she kept for mercy could one day be read as treason. Still, she did not stop. Faith, to her, was not obedience. It was persistence, the same quality that had defined every step of her life. And as the city settled once more into uneasy calm, she continued her quiet work, gathering threads no one else could see, weaving faith and power into a single invisible pattern. A pattern that would hold, for now. But nothing in Byzantium held forever, because the same question that haunted the empire's creeds would soon return to haunt its rulers. How many natures can one body contain, divine or human or empire, before it begins to break? The empire's heart beat in Constantinople, but its veins stretched eastward, through Antioch and Edessa, across the Persian frontier, into the endless golden plains of Asia. Along those veins moved the lifeblood of Byzantium, silk. No cloth in the world carried such weight. It shimmered with both luxury and secrecy, a fabric of beauty and espionage. For centuries, its making had been the guarded art of China, passed from loom to loom under imperial watch. Byzantium could buy it, but never make it. That, Justinian decided, must change. He saw in silk not vanity, but sovereignty. Whoever controlled its trade controlled the world's desire. But where Justinian sought monopoly, Theodora saw connection. To her, the Silk Road was not a single route, but a living network. Merchants, monks, spies, slaves, courtesans, all bearing not only goods, but stories. In the palace's audience chambers, she sometimes received emissaries from distant lands, Sogdian traders in bright patterned robes, Nubian envoys in gold-threaded linen, Persian nobles with eyes like tempered steel. To each, she offered gifts with deliberate precision. A necklace of glass beads from Alexandria, a cloak woven in Tyre, a mirror of bronze cast in the capital. She understood that diplomacy began with reflection, in showing others themselves. Theodora had grown up among performers who could read an audience before a word was spoken. Now she used the same instinct to read men of state. Behind the silks and spices, the Silk Road was also the empire's nervous system of intelligence. Every caravan that arrived in Constantinople carried rumors of wars brewing in Persia, of tribes shifting in the Caucasus, of monks smuggling silkworm eggs inside hollow canes. It was through such rumors that Theodora learned first of two Nestorian monks traveling west from the mountains beyond Persia, bearing an impossible story. They claimed to know how silk was made. When the monks arrived in the capital, weary and dust-streaked, they were received not by the emperor's ministers, but first, quietly, by Theodora. They told her of their journey through India and Serica, as the Greeks called China, where they had seen the secrets of silk cultivation. They spoke of trees whose leaves fed the worms, of delicate eggs carried in secrecy, of the shimmering cocoons that yielded the cloth of kings. Theodora listened, her expression unreadable. She asked few questions, but her attendants noted the sharpness in her gaze, the kind she wore when she sensed opportunity cloaked as chance. Later, Justinian would meet the monks, reward them, and arrange for the silkworm eggs to be smuggled into Byzantium, hidden within hollow bamboo rods. This moment, half legend, half fact, would forever alter the empire's economy. But Theodora's role, as always, was the unseen one. It was she who ensured the monks' safety on their return through hostile Persian lands. It was she who arranged, through her network of couriers and traders, that the first mulberry groves near Constantinople were planted under imperial protection. It was she who sent gifts to local weavers, persuading them to adapt their looms for the finer threads. And when years later, the first bolts of Byzantine silk emerged from the workshops of the capital, shimmering blue and gold, she ordered that a portion be distributed to the poor women of the city to clothe them in dignity as in splendor. To Theodora, silk was never merely fabric. It was transformation, raw, fragile, and then, through patience, made radiant. She saw in it an allegory for empire itself, born from secrecy, shaped by struggle, perfected through care. The Empress of Silk, they began to call her in whispers, not because she ruled the trade, but because she understood its spirit. She also used the trade routes as channels of quiet diplomacy. While Justinian's envoys carried decrees, Theodora's couriers carried letters written in her fine, decisive hand. She corresponded with queens and noblewomen in distant courts, allies who could whisper where men could not. In one surviving letter to a Persian noblewoman, she wrote, "Between us lies not war, but the space in which peace might be grown. Men speak of conquest, we of continuance. May the threads between our homes remain unbroken." To historians, this letter seems poetic. To contemporaries, it was political, a plea for the safety of women and merchants caught between two empires' wars. She was, in a sense, weaving her own Silk Road, one of correspondence and compassion, parallel to the caravans of profit and power. From the Red Sea to the Caucasus, stories of her mercy spread faster than any decree. In Armenian villages, mothers told tales of the Queen of Silk, who clothed the poor in the fabric of heaven. In Antioch, merchants toasted her name when their ships returned safely from Alexandria, thanks to her quiet intercession with the governors. Even in Persia, Byzantium's eternal rival, her name carried a strange respect. The Shah's court poets wrote of a woman of gold light who tames the winds with her gaze. It was myth, yes, but myth born from presence. She had, without armies, crossed borders that no general could. By the end of her reign, silk workshops flourished across the empire. In Constantinople, Thessalonica, Berytus, the trade routes, once dominated by Persia, began to bend toward Byzantium. The empire no longer bought beauty, it produced it. But Theodora's satisfaction was not in commerce. It was in creation, the quiet, steady act of transforming fragility into strength. Sometimes, in her private chambers, she would take a small scrap of silk and hold it to the light, letting it glow between her fingers. It shimmered, like water, like breath, like life itself. Perhaps in that reflection she saw herself, a life once hidden in darkness, carried across worlds, reborn in radiance, the Empress of the Silk Road, not because she owned it, but because she understood its soul. It began with a chill that never lifted. By the winter of 547, Constantinople was beautiful and broken. The marble gleamed, the domes shone, but the air was heavy, with incense, with silence, with the memory of too many funerals. The Great Plague had passed, yet its echo remained in empty homes and cautious hearts. In the palace, Theodora kept mostly to her private apartments, the golden chambers overlooking the gardens of Daphne, where cypress trees whispered in the sea wind. Servants said she rose later each morning, walked slower, and ate little. Physicians came and went, offering tonics of honey and herbs, prayers and theories. But none could cure the weariness that crept through her body like winter seeping through stone. They called it a lingering fever, perhaps a disease of the womb. No one spoke of death, not yet. Justinian refused to see her illness as mortal. To him, Theodora had always been indestructible, the woman who faced riots, councils, and kings without trembling. He visited her daily, often at dawn, when the city was still grey and silent. He would sit by her couch, unrolling parchment, discussing new laws, edicts, taxes, the machinery of empire continuing even as its heart faltered. Sometimes she smiled faintly and said, "You always did find comfort in the details, my love." But there were days when she could not rise to greet him. On those mornings, the emperor paced the corridors, his sandals whispering against the mosaic floors, refusing to speak with anyone. Outside, the empire endured, stretched thin across frontiers from Italy to Egypt. Wars dragged on, gold ran low, and faith still divided the provinces. Theodora no longer rode in processions or presided over councils. Her absence was noticed more than her presence once had been. Yet even from her couch, she ruled, quietly, efficiently, through whispers and sealed letters. When governors hesitated in enforcing her reforms to protect women, they received messages written in her unmistakable hand, elegant and unflinching. When a bishop in Egypt persecuted a monophysite congregation, her emissary arrived within weeks, carrying her reprimand like a commandment. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but her words did not. Her circle of attendants had grown smaller. Euphemia, her old confidant, remained, a quiet shadow, tending to her hair, her ink, her prayers. Sometimes they spoke of the old days, the theatre, the streets of Constantinople before the marble. Theodora would laugh softly and then cough until the laughter turned to pain. She began to see her life not as a series of triumphs, but as a pattern woven, each thread crossing another in purpose unseen until now. There were nights when she asked to be carried to the balcony overlooking the sea. From there, she watched the ships drifting in the dark waters of the Bosporus, their lanterns flickering like distant souls. She said little, only that she liked the cold, because it reminded her she was still among the living. The empire, though vast, had become a kind of solitude. Theodora understood this better than anyone. Power, she once said, is the most crowded loneliness. And yet, even in illness, she found small rituals to anchor her days. She oversaw the distribution of bread to the poor through the convents she had founded. She summoned architects to review the progress on new churches in her name. She listened to petitions brought by women, still, even now, seeking her intervention against cruel husbands or unjust magistrates. Each story, she said, kept her heart awake. It was not political, not even formal. A letter to the man, not the emperor. No copy survives, but chroniclers hint at its tone. Neither farewell nor confession, but gratitude. She thanked him, they say, for the life they had built, for the empire they had ruled together, and for the love that had survived the weight of crowns. When the letter was finished, she asked for it to be sealed in gold thread and placed beside her on the pillow. That night, the lamps burned low in her chamber. Euphemia kept watch as the Empress slept, or seemed to. But Theodora's breathing grew shallow, her skin pale as the linen beneath her. By dawn, the cold she had once welcomed had become eternal. The Empress of Byzantium was gone. The city awoke to the tolling of slow, deliberate bells. Priests marched through the streets carrying incense, and crowds gathered silently before Hagia Sophia. Theodora's body, wrapped in silk woven from the very worms she had brought to Byzantium, was borne through the city she had remade. Justinian followed behind, walking slowly, his face hidden by a veil of mourning. The citizens bowed as she passed, not in fear, but in gratitude for the laws she had written, the poor she had protected, the dignity she had restored to so many. When they laid her to rest within the church of the Holy Apostles, the emperor lingered long after the priests had gone. He placed a single object beside her, a fragment of purple silk, the color of the imperial robe they had shared. And there, history becomes quiet. Theodora disappears from its daily record, leaving only the echo of her presence, in laws still quoted centuries later, in mosaics that still catch the light, in the silent endurance of women whose names were never written. Constantinople endured. The empire endured. But something in its spirit changed after her passing, a softness within the stone, a human pulse beneath the gold. In the long years that followed, Justinian would continue to rule, to build, to legislate. Yet those closest to him said that, in private moments, he would pause mid-sentence, as if listening for a voice that was no longer there. History remembers him as the great, the builder, the lawgiver, the emperor. But even greatness, he learned, is cold without companionship. And so ended the life of Theodora, actress, penitent, empress, silk weaver of empire, a woman who rose from dust to diadem, and in doing so, remade the texture of power itself. But perhaps there is one last question that history never answers. When power fades and empires fall silent, what remains of the hands that once held the world's thread? Is it the marble, or the mercy woven into the cloth of memory? After her death, the empire did not stop. Empires never do. They continue to breathe, to legislate, to build, as if the humans who animated them were only temporary instruments of something larger. Yet within that endless machinery, a silence lingered, a pause in the rhythm of power. Those who had served Theodora said that for months after her passing, the halls of the great palace felt strangely empty. The sound of sandals on marble seemed too loud, the whisper of silk too lonely. Justinian ruled on for nearly 2 decades. He rebuilt what war and plague had broken, wrote new laws, completed new churches. But even his chroniclers noticed that his language changed after her death. The edicts grew softer in tone, more deliberate, less consumed by conquest. It was as if the edges of ambition had been worn smooth by grief. He still spoke of divine order, but now it sounded more like longing than doctrine. In his later years, he would often visit the Church of the Holy Apostles, where Theodora was entombed beside other rulers of Byzantium. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with a small retinue, his steps slow beneath the vaults that shimmered with gold mosaics. No one knows what he said there, if he spoke at all. But legend holds that he would rest his hand upon the cold stone of her tomb and murmur a single word, consort, a title both humble and vast. Outside the palace, life continued in its ordinary, magnificent monotony. The markets bustled with silk, not Persian now, but Byzantine. Women walked the streets in modest robes of violet and blue, cut in the new imperial fashion. In the law courts, advocates quoted the Empress's statutes protecting the poor and the vulnerable. They spoke her name less and less, but her will remained woven through the fabric of daily life. That, perhaps, is the truest form of legacy, not to be remembered, but to be lived through others, quietly, invisibly, as the texture of justice or mercy or endurance. Theodora had entered history as a scandal and left it as structure. The courtiers who had once mocked her origins now dressed their daughters in her style. Monks who had called her heretic now prayed in churches she had commissioned. Women who had no place in the laws of men now found their names written, their rights defined. Even centuries later, when chroniclers in distant lands spoke of her, they could not quite decide what to make of her. Was she saint or sinner? Witch or wisdom? A courtesan who fooled an empire, or a ruler who redeemed it? The truth, as always, lay somewhere between the categories history prefers. The mosaics of Ravenna offer one answer. There, in the Basilica of San Vitale, Theodora still stands, a figure in tesserae, forever mid-step, forever radiant. Her robe gleams with pearls, her gaze calm and direct. In one hand, she holds a chalice, offering it toward the altar. In the other, she gathers her mantle, as if preparing to move. The artistry is precise, almost mathematical, yet something human breathes within it. Look closely, and you can see the faint trace of wear along the tiles of her face, as though time itself has touched her gently, acknowledging rather than erasing. She stands opposite Justinian, equal in size, equal in majesty, the only empress of Byzantium to be so depicted. Two halves of a vision, law and compassion, order and will. Their eyes do not meet, yet they belong to the same horizon. In the dim candlelight, pilgrims still pause before her image, centuries after her bones turn to dust. Some pray, others simply stare, wondering how such stillness could hold such life. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the faint rustle of silk, the sound of the Empress crossing a marble floor, the echo of footsteps through time. For Theodora's life was not erased by death, it was absorbed into the empire's memory, into the rhythm of its breath. Every law that protected a widow, every convent that gave refuge to the broken, every woman who dared to speak in the courts of men, all carried her whisper. In that way, she never truly vanished. She became the space between justice and mercy, between silence and speech. Even the chronicler Procopius, her fiercest critic, could not escape her. In his secret history, written in bitterness and fear, he painted her as a monster of cruelty and lust. But his outrage, preserved for centuries, only ensured her survival. To condemn her was to keep her name alive, and in the slow patience of history, the scandal faded while the strength remained. She endures now as an idea, that power can rise from anywhere, that grace can coexist with ruthlessness, that history, like silk, is made of both fragility and endurance. And when the lamps of Byzantium finally went out, when Constantinople fell 1,000 years later to new conquerors, the mosaics of Theodora still glittered through the dust. A final glimmer of empire, a final echo of a woman who had once said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." She had been right, but even finer perhaps is to become a thread that never breaks. So now, as the story fades and the sea wind drifts once more through the ghostly halls of the great palace, you might imagine the echo of her voice, soft, measured, still sure of itself. She does not ask for worship, only remembrance, not for the crown, but for the hands that held it steady. And somewhere, beyond the marble, beyond the centuries, that echo lingers, quiet, patient, woven into the endless fabric of history.